Yeah. Good morning. The committee will come to order. You know, today we want to consider the Toxic Exposure Fund Improvement Act. Now, before we get that, I want to address the business meeting that we scheduled and then canceled last week. The committee staff met to hold another transcribed interview on the witness in the sexual harassment investigation, and without warning, 2 minutes prior to interview, the minority declared they would not participate in the interview, and the VA quickly followed suit. I was prepared to hold another subpoena vote to compel VA to participate. VA assured us that they will cooperate and transcribe interviews regardless of whether the minority is in attendance or not. This is consistent with House rules. Therefore, I decided business meeting to consider another subpoena is not necessary today, and I hope that you there will not be any more obstructions to the committee's oversight. But there is, and I won't hesitate to ask for a subpoena vote. Now, back to the matter at hand here today. This bill is attempting to fix the unintended consequences of creation of the Toxic Exposure Fund that have handcuffed this committee from moving legislation forward. Some of the mechanics are complicated, but the goal is very simple. We need a toxic exposure fund that pays for the healthcare expansions and the cost to deliver the benefits under the PACT Act. Let me say that again. We need a toxic exposure fund that pays for the health expansion and the cost to deliver the benefits under the PACT Act. However, the TEF was never intended to cover VA health care on or benefits not related to the toxic exposure or that existed before the PACT Act. So everything we were covering before, it shouldn't take away from that and shouldn't be used for that. We should actually, and shouldn't be counted against it. There's no reason that the fund has to meddle with the Budget Act and create budget problems for other pieces of veterans legislation that we think are vitally important. So I want to address the bad faith policy attacks and scary rumors right now. Right now. This bill would not abolish, let me say that again, would absolutely not abolish or cut or undermine the Toxic Exposure Fund under any circumstances. In fact, the bill is even more generous than the VA says they will need to deliver, what they will need to deliver the PACT Act care and benefits to our veterans and their families. My bill would continue the dollar amounts that Congress already appropriated to fund for fiscal year 2024 and 2025, and the bill would allow almost $4 billion more, if you'll look, than VA has requested for 2026. After that, the amount available increases by 8% every year. The rate of increase is larger than VA's own healthcare inflation numbers. Now, beyond 2033, the bill requires proposing the next 10 years of funding, and that would receive special consideration in Congress. It would also give VA more flexibility to carry dollars over from year to year to the fund. And it would finally solve a wonky inside beltway problem that has stopped a lot of good bipartisan legislation from moving through this committee. Right now, any bill that we try to advance relating to healthcare, research, VA administrative operations, or IT has a mandatory cost. As many of you know, this committee only has one major offset to pay for our legislation to get it passed out of the House. Now, once that offset is used up, and unless stakeholders want to identify new offsets, our ability to pass bills is limited for the rest of the year. We have been working for months to finalize with the Senator Elizabeth Dole Veterans Package, and this issue has made doing that much more difficult. The Toxic Exposure Fund Improvement Act is my proposal to solve this problem without, let me say that again, without impacting PACT Act authorities. We have been discussing how unfortunate the situation is since the fall of 2022. It's time to stop playing Monday morning quarterback. We all have to get off the sidelines and get on the field and start doing something about it. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. If anyone has a proposal, I will welcome it. Let's work together. Let's find a compromise. Let's be bipartisan. Without a doubt, this is a bipartisan problem. But if we don't fix it, the Congressional Budget Office has assured us that it will continue to plague the next chairman and future committee members while they try to legislate. That is a disservice to every single veteran, caregiver, and survivor. The PACT Act was a historic achievement, and I want to thank the ranking member for his hard work on that, but it would be a tragedy if it was the last major law this committee is able to produce. We are responsible for authorizing all VA programs and services for all veterans so that they can get care and benefits they've earned. Now, in order to carry out that responsibility, we need to get these handcuffs off. I want to welcome our witnesses, and I hope to have a productive conversation about the best way to accomplish that. Ranking Member Takano, I now recognize you for your opening statement.
Well, thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman. The Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund, created by my Honor Our PACT Act, is a vital component of the law and represents our promise to toxic exposed veterans that we will not waver in our commitment to delivering the care and benefits they have earned. Congress voted to establish this fund to ensure that the Department of Veterans Affairs, and most importantly, veterans, would have access to the funding necessary to carry out this law in perpetuity. Honoring our pact is a promise, one that I have no interest in reneging on. The majority is proposing to hamstring that fund less than 2 years after the PACT Act became law by capping appropriations and narrowing its purpose. And this would seriously impair VA's ability to perform the task we have assigned it to do. In short, it would undermine the PACT Act, and I can't support that. The PACT Act is a huge step forward for America's veterans because it takes seriously the implicit promise our nation makes to service members when they enlist in our military. If you get injured or disabled or sick because of your service, we will have your back. You will get medical care. You and your dependents will get compensation if you are disabled. Fulfilling this promise is clear when a service member loses a limb from a roadside bomb or suffers a neurological complication from a nerve agent deployed by the enemy. The immediate effects of war are seen as the costs of war. It would be untenable for anyone to say these costs should be met based on whether we could afford to pay them. We have an obligation to pay for them. Therefore, we must pay for them as the cost of war. The effects of toxic exposure are often not so immediate, but they are no less debilitating. Chronic respiratory illnesses linked to exposure to burn pits, for example, can show up in veterans many years after their deployments are done. Cancers that show up disproportionately in young adults after their service can reasonably be linked to service-connected toxic exposure, but they do not manifest themselves immediately either. Congress decided that 23 categories of illnesses would be presumed to be service-connected for service members known to have deployed in geographic areas where they could have been exposed to toxins. We decided to treat these debilitating illnesses as the cost of war and not as expenses that we would decide on an annual basis because it was the morally right thing to do. Classifying care and benefits for toxic exposed veterans as a mandatory cost instead of an optional or discretionary cost is what we owed veterans. This was our promise through the PACT Act, much like Medicare and Social Security are our promises to the broader public. This means not subjecting veterans to a Hunger Games scenario of pitting veteran against veteran or veterans against other Americans to fight for funding. We agreed that we would not pit toxic-exposed veterans against other Americans in need, whether it be hungry children, seniors, those going to college, Americans who need job training, or even other veterans who use these programs. This legislation could have the effect of, and I mean by the majority's legislation, could have the effect of taking us back to a situation of deciding which veterans programs would get cut or whether we would have to deny benefits to some cohort of toxic-exposed veterans. However, we have today a wonderful opportunity to once again lay bare the differences between our sides and our respective approaches to providing care and treatment to toxic-exposed veterans. Sadly, it seems that for my colleagues, this has only ever been a budgetary issue to solve. Or more accurately, that our solution to addressing toxic exposure should be constrained by fiscal concerns instead of doing what is right for veterans. When the committee began consideration of the PACT Act in June 2021, my colleagues were strongly opposed, with the then ranking member, now Chairman Boss, saying, quote, "We need to stop wasting time marking up legislation that we know has no path to success," end quote. In fact, the chairman was the very first no vote against the PACT Act in committee. Dr. Murphy even went on to state, quote, "We simply cannot spend away because of emotional needs," end quote. Healthcare for toxic-exposed veterans isn't an emotional need. It is a medical one that deserves our time, attention, and investment. Now, fast forward to this time 2 years ago, and the House, for the first time, passed the most expansive increase in veterans' health care and benefits since the GI Bill, a vote which Chairman Boss was not present for. Yet, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle still largely objected to it, both in scope and cost. Led by then Minority Leader McCarthy and Whip Scalise, 174 Republicans voted against the bill. As Chairman Boss said at the time, quote, "House Democrats shoved the deeply flawed policies and wildly expensive costs of the PACT Act through the House," end quote, and then referred to the PACT Act as, quote, "empty promises," end quote. I doubt any of the hundreds of thousands who have benefited from the law views the PACT Act as deeply flawed. And thankfully, there were 34 Republicans who showed leadership and courage and voted for the bill. But it should have been unanimous from the beginning. Indeed, Chairman Boss chose to push a less than half measure in the Health Care for Burn Pits Veterans Act, a provision, mind you, that we included in the PACT Act, but that in its entirety alone increased health care access by only 24,000 veterans compared to the over 270,000 and growing list added because of the full PACT Act being enacted. Apparently, shutting out the other 250,000 veterans was okay with our majority because it kept the, quote, "wildly expensive," end quote, costs down. Thankfully, when the House voted for the final time on the PACT Act in July 2022, most of my Republican colleagues, including the chairman, had seen the light or read the political tea leaves and came around to supporting the legislation. Yet, even then, my colleagues expressed reservations about the funding mechanism in the bill. To again quote the chairman, quote, "The fund is also a budgetary ploy by the Democrats to take existing healthcare costs that have nothing to do with toxic exposure and transfer them from discretionary to mandatory spending," end quote. Well, Mr. Chairman, shifting healthcare costs from the discretionary side of the ledger to the mandatory side was exactly the point. We have made a promise through the PACT Act to our veterans, and that's what the P in PACT stands for, that they will have access to health care for conditions related to toxic exposure. And the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund is the mechanism through which we are ensuring that promise is kept, for this generation and future ones as well. So why are you now trying to walk away from that? I refuse to go back to a time when veterans must compete with other domestic spending priorities for funding. And I refuse to concede that cost should be an issue when addressing the legacy of toxic exposure among our veterans. Does the majority propose to tell us today which of the 270,000 veterans newly enrolled into VA health care they don't want to serve? I doubt it. Will you detail for us today which of the 830,000 veterans with approved PACT Act disability claims you feel shouldn't have been awarded benefits? Of course you won't. But perhaps the majority intends to send with caps on the cost of toxic work exposure fund. Is that VA has done enough? That they shouldn't approve any more disability claims or add any more veterans to the healthcare rolls or create any new presumptions of service connection. I highly doubt that is the case either. So then, why are we here? The only answer to that question that I can muster is that the majority once again wants to pretend that it is the party of fiscal conservatism. Only this time, it comes at the expense of toxic exposed veterans and their care. And to that, Mr. Chairman, I will leave you with another quote, this time from the gentleman from Montana, Representative Rosendale, who so aptly said, quote, "We are willing to spend far too much money to engage in conflict and far too little to care for our warriors once they come home," end quote. Mr. Chairman, I couldn't agree more, and I yield back.
Well, I thank the ranking member for his opening statement. We both read our scripts now. And now I'm going off script. I just came off of an election where half-truths and misquotes were used against me. I think I just saw that again. Because let me explain to you, when the first PACT Act first tried to move out of the House, even the Senate itself and the VA said under the existing language they could not implement the PACT Act to what we know today as being very good and being able to achieve the goal of the PACT Act. Instead, it was trying to be shoved out of the House for what I believe was a political move. Now, we came to a point where we got to an agreement and we used the PACT Act. Even then, though, I talked about the concern that we had with the Toxic Exposure Fund of double counting, and that's the problem. It double counts the dollars and therefore takes away from the ability for us to implement things like the Elizabeth Dole Act, which we're trying so desperately to do. It is an error in the way that we wrote it. I am in no way, let me be very, very clear and very honest. Like I said, I'm not scripted here. It is in no way wanting to, regardless of the political spin, saying we want to take away from our veterans. We want to add to what we can do for our veterans. We need to drop the political rhetoric that our staff writes and actually start sitting down together and working. And that's what this hearing is about today. Listening from the VA on where they're at with this, whether they're opposed or not to my particular legislation. And I said, if you've got other ideas, come forward. Because right now, we're being drugged down by the fact when CBO scores what we're doing. And we don't have the advantage of actually doing the things that many of you on your side of the aisle and our side of the aisle want to continue to do for our veterans. Because of what I believe, an improper counting of the dollars that we're spending. Why in the world, if someone is already receiving their medical care, do we double count it the way this legislation is written? Why in the world would we all of a sudden write this so that when the VA decides to move forward with something that really doesn't have to do with toxic exposure, we're going to go ahead and say, oh, well, the way it's written, you can take money from the TIF and not go for toxic exposure, but building over here or do something else over here, instead of providing it for our veterans who I believe both I and the ranking member want to support. Now, we've listened to the rhetoric. Because I went on like that, I'll be glad to let you have a response, but then we'll listen to the witnesses. So.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time to respond. Let me just, first of all, dispense with the notion that the TEF was the reason why the Elizabeth Dole Act was not able to go forward. My staff spent a lot of time with CBO to come up with a revised score, a modicum of which might have been related to TEF, but most of all, it was, we pointed out the mistaken way in which they were calculating the sheer costs of Elizabeth Dole. So let's not associate the difficulties with Elizabeth Dole with primarily being connected with the TEF. That is not true. We're going to hear testimony today from our witness from the VA that will show the very rigorous way in which they account for the costs and how the way the TEF is structured has facilitated VA to be able to reach out to so many people, to have a backlog that is far less than everybody agreed. I agree that we do need to take a look at how CBO scores in light of the TEF, but that's something that we can take care of by working with our appropriators and with each other. But to fundamentally change the way that we have assigned the costs of toxic exposure to the mandatory account and now revising it back to a discretionary frame, I think is a big mistake and is the fundamental disagreement. And I don't want to go back to the good old bad days, especially when we have a very, very large new obligation that we said we must take on, that we are going to pit veterans against other veterans programs and pit them against other Americans in need. I will stop there. I'm eager to hear from our witness from VA to actually hear how the TEF has worked with their being able to facilitate reaching so many veterans and how they're going to reach so many more. And I yield back.
Thank you. Now I'd like to introduce the witnesses for the Department of Veterans Affairs. First, we have the Honorable John Rychelski, the Assistant Secretary of Management and Chief Financial Officer. We also have Laura Duke, the Chief Financial Officer of Veterans Health Administration, and Ms. Leshiko Graham, the Chief Financial Officer of the Veterans Benefits Administration. If each one of you would rise, I ask the witness to rise and raise their right hand. Do you solemnly swear, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you, and let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Mr. Rychelski, you are recognized for 5 minutes to deliver your opening statement, and we thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Boss, Ranking Member Takano, and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting us here today to present our views on the draft Toxic Exposure Fund Improvement Act. Joining me today, as you introduced, are Laura Duke from VHA and Leshiko Graham from VBA. The Sergeant First Class Heath Robinson, honoring our promise to address comprehensive toxics, or PACT Act, signed into law by President Biden on August 10th, 2022, authorizes VA to deliver veterans health care and benefits associated with exposure to environmental hazards during military service. Section 324 of the PACT Act established the Cost of War Toxic Exposures Fund, or TEF. The pairing of this transformational legislation with a highly effective funding mechanism, the Toxic Exposures Fund, has unquestionably benefited veterans in substantial ways. I'd like to illustrate one example of that. A veteran exposed to herbicides while serving in Thailand in the early 70s had been trying to get service connection for Parkinson's disease, type 2 diabetes, and peripheral neuropathy for the last 7 years. All his previous claims and appeals had been denied. On the first day we granted PACT Act benefits, that vet was granted a service connection for 13 disabilities. That's because the PACT Act added a presumptive for his service in Thailand. For him, that's a retroactive and monthly benefit that will go a long way in supporting his well-being for the rest of his life. And the Toxic Exposures Fund provided the resources to make that possible. This same scenario is playing out thousands of times each day. As of February 2024, VA has completed more than 5 million toxic exposure screenings, and there are more than 4 million current enrollees in the PACT Act planning population. VA has approved over 700,000 claims related to the PACT Act for veterans or survivors, and over 900,000 total veterans and survivors have completed PACT Act-related claims. The Toxic Exposures Fund has allowed us to fully deliver what we owe to this veteran and many others in health and compensation benefits without jeopardizing other VA programs because of competing funding requirements. We have approached our use of the Toxic Exposures Fund responsibly with great care and thought. The fund is not available for use for all PACT Act provisions. We have worked closely with our General Counsel, the Office of Management and Budget, as well as the organizations receiving toxic exposure funding to develop allocation methodologies that adhere to the intent of the law and are effective, traceable, and auditable while not impeding our ability to serve veterans. Once all parties agree an allocation methodology has met this high standard, we publish the methodology and requirements in a financial policy. In 2023, we asked the Office of the Inspector General to review our work. In February 2024, they issued a report that commended the Office of Management for proactively seeking legal guidance from the Office of General Counsel to ensure that TEF allocations are used in accordance with their authorized purposes. We have since briefed the details of our approach on the use of this fund and our methodologies to numerous authorizer and appropriator staff, as well as veteran service organizations and the Office of the Inspector General. We have made our TEF use policies available on our policy website, and we provide monthly execution reports to oversight committees detailing our use of the funds. Given the great success of the PACT Act and the Toxic Exposures Fund, we are concerned about the certain provisions contained in the Toxic Exposure Fund Improvement Act and potential unintended consequences that may adversely affect veterans. We are happy to discuss the proposed legislation and look forward to working with this committee to ensure veterans continue to receive the health care and benefits they have earned without jeopardizing other VA programs. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rachowski. And the written statement of Mr. Rachowski will be entered into the hearing record. We will now proceed to questions, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes as soon as I get to my questions. Mr. Rachowski, if we don't solve the mandatory cost problem and restore this committee's ability to legislate, sooner or later, VA will ground to a halt. There will be legislation that you need that we can't pass. Do you agree that the problem has to be solved?
Yes, I do agree that problem needs to be solved.
Okay, also, then going that way, the administration and the VA oppose my legislation. How do you propose to solve the problem?
Well, I believe that Congress, created this problem, and Congress is going to have to solve it. Congress did not ask us for our opinion on creating the TEF or mandatory funding at that time. But now they're asking us to fix it. So I guess we see how that works.
But yet you say you're opposed to this proposal, but we still have the problem.
What I would say, Chairman Bost, is I recognize the problem. We just have concerns with how this is structured and maybe what some of the longer term effects of it will be. I don't dispute the problem. The solution is complicated. If it were easy, it'd already be solved.
Sure. So, well, putting the budget jargon aside, so let's go. The VA receives the Toxic Exposure Fund dollars from Congress just like any other dollar. You don't really have any guarantee now, but my bill sets spending levels through 2033 that lets VA propose funding through 2045. Isn't that actually more of a guarantee than what we have now?
Well, I think the elephant in the room is if discretionary funding was possible, it would have been used initially. And I think the problem is discretionary funding was not available, which is why they used mandatory. And that makes me skeptical that you're going to be able to turn this into discretionary funding and that we're going to be able to see that funding.
Okay. The administration is using the Toxic Exposure Fund to move VA spending out of discretionary so they can spend more money on other agencies. You mentioned labor, HUD, and HHS. Republicans have never had a problem prioritizing veterans. We've proved that over and over again when even people are saying, oh, no, they're going to cut veterans, and we've shown over and over again we don't. Now, your opposition to the bill seems to be more about the other agencies and less about VA. How do you respond to that?
No, it's definitely about, that is a concern, but it's more about the VA. And let me just give you just a short example. We're early in the PACT Act. Just 2 weeks ago, we expanded health benefits under Section 103. We don't know what that's going to cost. We were given the authority to expand, look at presumptives in relation to toxic exposure. We don't know where that's going to lead us. And my concern is that it's premature to narrow the scope, sunset this, and to put caps at this point in time. We just don't know. We need a guaranteed source of funding. You've seen what we've been able to do with the funding and the PACT Act. We've done a lot for veterans. My concern is that this bill the unintended consequence may be to limit our ability to do that.
So here's the thing. If we don't go forward with this bill. And believe me, I'm not a person that says, okay, I'm always going to be right on every bill. But if we don't have this conversation that we're having here today, what's going to happen is we're going to be like the guy who jumps off the Empire State Building and they ask him at the 30th floor, how's everything going? They're fine just now. We're going to hit the bottom. And when we do, all of these things that we want to do as members, we're not going to be able to do it because we're double counting. Do you agree with me that we're double counting according to CBO, not according to VA, but the CBO is double counting? Do you believe that?
I mean, I can't speak to CBO's estimates. With respect to what our counting and our execution, I absolutely do not agree with that. We are not double counting.
Okay, VA isn't. But when it counts against us, when we're trying to present any bill through, we've got to have an advantage that allows us to say, no, this person was already receiving care. Now, they do qualify under the PACT Act, but they were already receiving care. But now we're going to count them again. You don't do that because you're going to do your budget just the way your budget is. But CBO does. Therefore, it ties us, as I said in my opening, it handcuffs us. I'm not bound to this particular piece of legislation. But it's the idea that we've come up with that we can clearly see that we meet those requirements above and beyond at times what VA estimates the cost are going to be. So when and how, and I'm out of time here, and I want to keep this on schedule today. But I would like to know, as the other witnesses asking questions, or other members are asking questions, each of us need to weigh out. When we're told we don't want to pit veteran against veteran, but we actually are, because of the way CBO is scoring this. So with that, I'll yield back and turn it over to the ranking member for his questions.
So with regard to the way CBO is scoring all of this, I believe that we do have ways to get with the appropriators, so that's a whole other question. But I just want to point out that on the first page of this bill, the majority changes the name of the fund, dropping the cost of war section. Instead of calling it the cost of war toxic exposure bill, they just call it, so I want to know what the purpose of that is. They claim to agree with us that the true cost of war includes care for veterans when they return home. Yet the very first action in the bill undermines or belies that fact. The same party that cheered and high-fived when Senate Republicans, led by former Senator Toomey, blocked passage of the PACT Act because of the fund, which they labeled a slush fund, and that was sort of implied by the chairman's comments. The same party that had to be shamed by veterans sleeping on the steps of the Capitol into doing the right thing is now asking veterans to simply trust that they are not undermining the law's promise. Yet we have before us this poorly drafted bill with no guarantees of funding for care and benefits either now or in the future. The majority uses a shell game, proposing to take money that only exists on paper and transferring that to an imaginary lockbox at the Treasury. And then they would prevent that money from being used by VA to help toxic exposed veterans until Congress gives its blessing. That would hinder VA's agility implementing the law and inject a great deal of uncertainty into the system, as VA couldn't count on funding being available in any given year. This uncertainty would start now in fiscal year 2024. All of this to achieve less than 1 year of relief from the TEF tax, according to CBO analysis of the bill. So as I mentioned, I view this bill at best as a serious impediment to VA's ability to implement the PACT Act for current and future veterans, and at worst, a cynical attempt to shrink a law they always thought was too big. Now, Mr. Wachowski, how has the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund helped VA implement the PACT Act?
Oh, it's helped us tremendously. I'll just give a couple of examples. Before the TEF fund, VBA claims production was like in the 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 range. Today, after TEF and hiring, it's approaching 11,000 a day. They had projected a backlog of 600,000 to 700,000. Because of TEF and hiring, the backlog is between 3 and 350, so almost half of that. We had the gradual ramp in of the healthcare benefits, enhanced healthcare benefits under Section 103. It was supposed to go through 2032, but we opened that to all veterans this year. Like for some veterans, that's 8 years earlier, and that's because of the TEF funding. So it's been remarkable.
So we've been able to accelerate to all potential beneficiaries. That's an extraordinary achievement.
It's an extraordinary achievement. That's 8 years for some veterans, 8 years sooner that they are getting health care, and that's because we are adequately funded, which is why whether it's the TEF, however, adequate funding is critical. And
well, I remember arguments actually on the Senate side against passing the PACT Act that this was going to cause a huge backlog, that they didn't trust VA's ability and they looked at previous history, but the TEF has enabled the ability to move tremendous numbers of people. Well, we see it, 820,000 claims being approved. There seems to be some disagreement between CBO and VA regarding whether the new TEF would be mandatory or discretionary. As the agency that is tasked with implementing this law in conjunction with OMB, what is your take on this?
if the bill came over as it's written today, it would be discretionary, and that is affirmed by OMB, their budget division, and also their general counsel. Whether that was the intent or not, I don't know, but that's how it's read.
Well, what feels like a gimmick to me is that the majority is proposing to put monopoly money in the fund. That is funding that just exists on paper. VA can't use it until Congress appropriates it a second time. And I don't know about you, but I would not have high confidence in this Congress appropriating anything once, let alone a second time. Is that VA's understanding of how this legislation works?
It is true that the scoring does not generate cash to put into the account, and that gets back to my previous comment about because discretionary funding was not available to fund this initially, I do have concerns going forward if it's changed to discretionary and the ability to appropriate and receive those funds.
Well, thank you very much. My time is up, and I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Radewagen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Talofa lava. Thank you, Chairman Bost and Ranking Member Takano, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the panel for your testimony. Mr. Richalski, what prevents the Toxic Exposure Act from becoming a slush fund?
Well, the first is the legislation and how it's written, but secondly, how we're implementing it, and we're doing that in strict consult with our general counsel, OMB, their general counsel, and asking for the IG's review of our execution to make sure that it does not become a slush fund.
And you've been using the Toxic Exposure Fund to move VA activities out of discretionary funding and into mandatory spending. Putting aside the budget implications of that, I'm also concerned that it limits Congress's oversight. Do you commit to cooperating with the committee as we give these activities extra scrutiny?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Representative Pappas, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And maybe, Mr. Richalski, if we could build on that a little bit, these claims, when the bill was being considered and being implemented, that there's some sort of a slush fund here with the TEF. You spoke a little bit about the internal controls that exist to comply with the statute. Can you give us a little bit more detail about how VA, or even Ms. Graham, how VBA determines what's TEF eligible and what isn't, and how it reports those expenditures?
Yeah, I'll let Lashiko speak as well. But what I would say is that we work very closely with each account. I mean, each account is different, and we looked at the costs. And I'll give you an example. When VBA looked at the TEF, we thought, if a claim comes in and it has one condition that's toxic exposed, we're going to count that as a TEF claim, and we're going to pay for it with toxic exposure dollars. When we consulted with our lawyers, they said you can't do that. That you can only charge the part of the claim that's related to toxic exposure. And so they had to go through an exercise figuring out the cost of a claim, how much would be toxic exposure. That's the kind of detail that we're going in. The other thing I would say is we're reviewing every receipt. Before we charge the toxic exposure fund, we're reviewing every receipt before we charge the fund. And Lashiko, you may have some more detail.
Absolutely. So as we finalized our operating plan and business rules associated with the PACT Act claims, we wanted to ensure that we were being consistent with the TEF as it stands in the appropriations. So we consulted with the Office of Field Operations, We consulted with OMB as well as Performance Analysis Integration Team to make sure that the individuals that were hired for PACT Act purposes would be coded properly in our HR system as well as in our finance systems. And so therefore, as we go through, as Mr. Rachowski said, and we're looking at the various costs associated with processing a claim, we're able to determine the employees that actually worked that particular claim and then do a reconciliation at the end of each month to ensure that the funds are in the appropriate account, whether it's the TEF account or our general operating expense funds. We also require that before individuals are hired or any funding that is spent on TEF related to contracts, salaries, or travel or anything of the sort, that there is a clear and direct nexus to the TEF itself. It is not, we are very clear in working with OGC that TEF and PACT Act are not synonymous. And so we make sure that it is definitely tied to the Toxic Exposure Fund.
Okay, thank you for helping us understand those internal controls. And Mr. Rachowski, you talked a little bit about how there were predictions, both from members of this committee as well as from VA, about a ballooning of the disability claims backlog with the passage of PACT Act. And we haven't seen those numbers because of a couple of things. One, dedicated VA employees that are doing this work day in and day out and are working incredibly hard to meet the moment for our veterans. And number two, the authorities within the PACT Act, because VA's been able to hire and train significant numbers of claims processing staff. They've used money from the Toxic Exposure Fund to do that. And recognizing that veteran service representatives currently don't just work on PACT Act claims. One of my concerns is that for the purposes of the fund, if they're restricted only to those expenses necessary to carry out the PACT Act, you will end up with two classes of employees, TEF-funded and non-TEF-funded employees, and that would potentially risk some of the progress you've made with the backlog. So could you talk a little bit about the implications for the way VBA does business with this legislation?
What I can say is if it becomes so complicated that we can't operationalize it and make sure that we're using the money appropriately, for example, for toxic exposure, then we don't use it and we have to use base funding. And if we do that too much, then we end up having to pull it from other programs. So it's important that, that the fund that we use is clear and concise and executable enough that we're able to support and do the things that we've done. And that's where I would say, Congress should definitely take a victory lap with PACT Act and the Toxic Exposure Fund. And I'm not saying that's the only way to fund this. All I'm saying is with adequate funding, we can do a lot, which we've seen. And that's why we're sort of jealously protecting that aspect of it.
Well, thank you for those comments. I do believe, and I think we all agree, that PACT Act was a landmark law. It's delivering important help and benefits to millions of American veterans who deserve it, some who have waited a real long time to get this assistance, and I think we should be working together to deal with some of the challenges that we face with respect to scoring of legislation, but we shouldn't be jeopardizing the future of this law and the help that it is going to provide and make a difference for so many veterans that we care deeply about on this committee. So thanks for those comments. I yield back.
Representative Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ranking Member Takano, for quoting me there today. And I stand by those comments, still by that quote. And as I know also that Chairman Boss does. And like Chairman Boss, we want to make sure that all of the dollars that are appropriated to the VA reach their intended destination. That is really what this is all about. And thank you, Chairman Boss, for holding this hearing. I was proud to vote for the PACT Act last Congress. The legislation expands VA health care and benefits for veterans exposed to burn pits, Agent Orange, and other toxic substances. The legislation created the Toxic Exposure Fund as a reliable funding mechanism to remove the cost of the PACT Act's health care expansion and administrative cost of its benefit expansion from the VA's discretionary budget. The VAs use the Toxic Exposure Fund as a flex fund to cover expenses that are not directly related to the PACT Act. The chairman's legislation attempts to clarify that the Toxic Exposure Fund should be used to fund health care and benefits-related administrative and IT expenses and medical research under the PACT Act, and not siphoned off for other purposes. That's all that legislation is for. Just as I said in my quote, we are always willing to spend an enormous amount of money to send our warriors into war, but we do not make the investment when they come home. Let's make sure that the investment is going where Congress directs it. where Congress directs it. That is our job. Mr. Rychalski, the Toxic Exposure Fund seems to be moving money around rather than actually increasing the resources to take care of the veterans. Looking at your 2025 request for your base budget and the TEF together, medical services is up by about $4 billion. And community care is taking roughly a $7 billion cut. Can you explain that to me, please?
I'm going to let Laura, but I'm going to speak to it. If you look at the request, it's misleading because that does not include the total funds we have available. We do have the TEF fund available. We do have carryover available. And when you look at those total sources of funds in 25, it actually does increase. But I don't know, Laura, if you want to add some color commentary to that?
Yes, so if you look at the total obligation anticipated growth in 2025, we do expect to obligate almost $41 billion for medical community care, which will be a 12% increase over 2024. It is the largest increase across our 4 appropriations, and that includes the resources that will be available under the TEF for the purpose of community care, as well as anticipated carryover expenses where we still have extra funds to the extent because of the timing of when the budget was requested and when the PACT Act was implemented, creating the TEF.
So, Mr. Rychalski, I think you're using the TEF the way a lot of states have been using their lotteries, quite frankly. They promised to boost education funding, almost every state. That's what they sold the lottery systems on. But in reality, they diverted part of the regular budget to pet projects, and schools didn't wind up with any money at all. The VA promised veterans dedicated funding for their toxic exposure-related health care. But in reality, you're using toxic exposure fund to dump costs out of your regular budget so that other agencies can spend more money. How does that benefit the veterans?
I mean, why would dispute the premise?
We're going to have to dig through the accounting, and I'm not a forensic accountant, but we certainly have people on staff that will show that those monies are being directed to other parts, and we want to be able to quantify how it's delivering health care. If there's deficiencies for funding in other areas within your control, shouldn't those requests be made through the Appropriations Committee to Congress?
I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. I mean, we've requested through our budget what we need.
So if you have deficiencies, again, we have the toxic exposure fund, and that has been defined about what it's to be used for. Unfortunately, it hasn't had enough, as they always say in this place, sideboards placed upon it to make sure that they can be specifically used for delivering that health care for people that have been exposed. If there are deficiencies in other areas, should those requests not come through Congress and through the appropriations process?
Congressman Rosendale, you know the IG looked at our healthcare approach for using the TEF and,
If you have
and endorsed it.
Mr. Rychalski, this is
That was
not a
the
really
IG.
complex question. If you have deficiencies in other areas, rather than utilizing those funds, should not you be going to Congress and requesting through the appropriations process support in those areas?
It's such a highly speculative question. I would have to see the specific incident.
I yield back, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Representative Sheriff McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. VA has used funding from Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund to great effect to manage the growing workload brought about because of the PACT Act. In particular, the Office of Information Technology has used TEF funding for several significant projects, including automated benefits delivery, VA.gov updates, modernization of VBMs, and software at the Board of Veterans Appeals. I think we would all agree that those are vital uses. However, as with so many other lines of business at the VA, those IT systems aren't used solely for the purpose of the PACT Act. I'm concerned that any attempt to limit TEF funding to only IT updates related to the PACT Act would in effect shut it off as sources of funding for modernization. So my question to you is, how has OIT already included TEF funding into future years' budget requests?
Specifics through our budget materials, but we consider. Okay, so we have, we consider TEF, the TEF requirements in our IT budget, VBA, healthcare, obviously, and that's included, for example, in our 25 budget, the amounts that we're going to use. We actually go down to the specific program and project and system and what they're going to do for those systems that's TEF-related. We can provide additional detail to you if you're interested in that, but it's sort of all built into our total budget request.
And can you talk about what limiting the TEF funding might mean for OIT's ability to modernize and maintain VA's many IT systems?
I mean, it's definitely been a force multiplier for us, and we've been able to accelerate modernization of some of these systems. You know, we talked about the backlog that we had anticipated in the 600,000 to 700,000 range. That's only 350. The production of 11,000 claims a day, where it used to be 6,000 to 7,000. IT systems figure prominently in that, and so the additional TEF funding has enabled them to speed up the modernization to support those new TEF claims. So it's been, you know, absolutely invaluable.
So would you agree that limiting it would actually stifle modernization?
We absolutely, oh, absolutely, yes.
Thank you, I yield back.
Representative Self, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about, I am a freshman. I was not here when the PACT Act was passed, and I have no quotes to be given in this forum. But I do have some questions because I was not here. So I want to explore the authorities. And I want to quote one of my colleagues that's been here longer than I have been. Occasionally, agencies and departments write rules that are diametrically opposed to the will and the intent of Congress. The authorities that you're talking about, and I'll pick up on Mr. Rosendale's comments, have you written the rules to execute the PACT Act? Do you believe that your rules follow the intent and will of Congress?
Well, we have written the policy that for each of the organizations receiving the Toxic Exposure Fund money, and I do believe those follow the intent of the law.
Then specifically in your testimony, you said that you expanded Section 103, I believe?
Yes.
And so I want to know specifically, by what authority did you expand Section 103? I have no idea what Section 103 is. By what authority did you expand?
You know, you're getting a little out of my area of expertise. Maybe I could take that for the record. I think that seems like a lawyer question to me.
Yeah, but I want to know, is it from the bill? Because when you expand it, it indicates to me that you may be expanding your authority under your department as opposed to under the law. Because as my colleague says, diametrically opposed to the will and the intent of Congress. I would like an answer to that question. And I want to go back to, and part of this is a larger issue in this Congress, because we have got to start to claw back Article I authority from the departments and the agencies, and I think we may have a good case here. We must start to understand that we're $34 trillion in debt. So when you say that other VA programs, you don't want to affect other VA programs across the government, we're going to have to start making choices if we're ever going to address our $34 trillion in debt. Not the VA, not only the VA, not any of the departments. We're going to have to start doing it because, to quote Ronald Reagan, the closest thing to eternal life on earth is a government program. And why is that? Because every program has a constituency, and every constituency wants to make sure that their program is not cut. But we're going to have to start balancing that if we're ever going to get a handle on our $34 trillion in debt. So mandatory cannot mean unlimited. And regardless of how we get at this problem that you have agreed with the chairman exists, we've got to get at this problem. And I think that we're going to need your help to get to a solution to the problem. So when you say it's Congress's problem, do not disabuse yourself of your help to the chairman in this committee as we move forward with that. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Am I on? To your question, it actually is in the law, 117, 168, at the end of Section 103, paragraph BI, states the Secretary may modify a date specified in subparagraph A, which is section 103, to an earlier date as the Secretary determines appropriate based on the number of veterans receiving hospital care, medical services, nursing home care of the subparagraphs referenced, and the resources available to the Secretary.
Thank you. Representative DeLucio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, folks. I want to start with something I think we all agree with, that there is a sacred obligation in this country to care for those we sent to fight, those who signed up to serve. I think then Chairman Takano's PACT Act is a substantial recognition of that obligation of this Congress meeting it to take care of not just veterans, but my fellow toxic exposed veterans who were sent to places where they dealt with some pretty horrible stuff in the air and otherwise. There's been a lot of discussion of the Toxic Exposure Fund, but that's not quite the right name. Mr. Rachowski, what is the actual name under the law of that fund? It's the Cost of War.
I'm sorry, yes, the Cost of War.
The Cost of War
yes.
Toxic Exposure Fund.
Yep.
I think when the American people send our fellow Americans to fight, they expect us to meet those costs. That could be bullets and guns, that can be armor, that can be tanks, that's medical beds, doctors. Some of those wounds show up years later. And I think that's the cost of war that we are dealing with in this piece of legislation and the proposal here today. I can't understand why Section 2 of the majority's bill cuts cost of war from the name of the fund. I hope it's an oversight. It seems to me a way to avoid the politics of not... Thank you, sir. Very good, Mr. Chairman. I think it's important because it is part of what we are doing in this Congress to care for my fellow veterans. Now, at its core, I understand there are some debates and discussions around what fiscal obligations we have. The American people, I think, expect us to care for veterans. The folks we've sent off to fight and serve, they'll bear that cost. If we have problems in our budget or otherwise, well, maybe we ought to tax the rich. Maybe the very people who, for every generation we sent folks off to fight, had their taxes increase, ought to pay a little more to care for the folks sent off to fight. So I don't think this is a fiscal problem that should be solved on the backs of veterans. I think it's a revenue issue that we have to address. I'm also concerned, I don't see VSOs in this hearing. I don't see them on this panel. I think they have something to say about their care and about the impact of this legislation on toxic exposed veterans. I hope we'll see good engagement from the VSOs as we go forward. Mr. Rachowski, I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to go to your testimony. You wrote, amending the PACT Act as suggested by the bill would severely constrain VA's ability to provide timely, high-quality health care and benefits to all veterans, including those with toxic exposure, close quote there. You also wrote the impact of the majority's bill would be, quote, that VA's ability to provide benefits and services for toxic exposed veterans would be significantly jeopardized. Why?
Well, let me give you an example. You can just do a simple math exercise. If you added up the total amounts provided in the Toxic Exposure Fund Improvement Act, add up those total amounts of funding that they would deposit in the account, and you compare that in the OMB budget tables for the fiscal year 25 budget we just released, we would receive $17 billion less in funding, and that would be difficult to make up. I mean, we'd have to make that up somewhere else. That's why it's...
And what would those somewhere else be within VA, for instance?
I mean, we would take it from other programs. It could be infrastructure, it could be equipment, I mean, it could be rural health, it could be wherever we needed to. Obviously, we're going to provide the care to veterans, so other things are going to, and that's our concern with, pulling back on funding too soon or sunsetting the fund too soon. We're really early into this. The other thing I would say, and this is an important aspect here, we are just kind of coming out of years of denial of the effects of toxic exposure to the age of enlightenment. We have now the statutory authority in the PACT Act or the statutory process to look at presumptives, and we have to have the resources to do that. The current Toxic Exposure Fund provides those resources. The Toxic Exposure Improvement Act does not. It narrowly scopes that. And so for presumptives coming down the line, it would not be covered under this fund. And so that's a problem. I mean, we're just really getting our hands around this.
In the 30 seconds I have left, I'll be brief. To confirm, the President's budget request did not request any changes that would cap appropriations for the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund?
That's correct. In fact, the OMB tables provide $17 billion more between 26 and 33 than this legislation does.
And nor did the president's request have anything about making this funding, shifting this funding into discretionary.
Correct.
Very good. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. For the record, I'd like to say that the VSOs were and have been meeting on this issue on a regular basis. They chose not to testify here today. And with that, Dr. Miller Meeks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for this important hearing. The questions I ask are coming both from the fact that I'm a 24-year Army veteran, as is my husband, and I'm also a physician and former director of the Iowa Department of Public Health. And we looked into toxic exposure, especially where we have the Iowa Army ammunition facility, which is within my district. And I voted for the PACT Act, the improved PACT Act when it came back from the Senate, voted for it, but still had some reservations about this bill. Not our obligation to take care of veterans who may be injured at the time or in the future from their service, especially in combat, but in other parts of the bill, which I'll address. Mr. Rakowski, the Toxic Exposure Fund statute is somewhat ambiguous, and the VA has written policies to govern how the money can be spent. What is not allowed?
Well, maybe I can give you an example. Best example I can give of that is we have a PACT program management office. We have a director of that program office. When the PACT Act was passed and the Toxic Exposure Fund was created, we thought, well, certainly the director of the PACT Act project management office, his salary would be funded. But when we worked through that with our general counsel, they said absolutely not. The Toxic Exposure Fund is only for costs related to toxic exposures. That individual does not spend all of his time or even most of his time specifically on toxic exposure, so you really can't charge, certainly not all of his salary, probably not most, maybe not even any of his salary. That's an example of the type of thing we have to go through to make sure that it's related to toxic exposure only, not just costs with the PACT Act.
And can you get us the other things that are not allowed or covered? You can submit that in writing.
Okay.
Most people thought the Toxic Exposure Fund, which was part of the PACT Act, was intended to pay for implementing the PACT Act. But the VA has also been using it to pay for toxic exposure-related programs that already existed. Can you identify those programs?
We only use it in most cases to the extent, well, really all cases to the extent that it exceeds, for example, healthcare, the 21 baseline, or that it's related to toxic exposure itself. And so we're not shifting baseline costs to TAP. I know people say that, but that's just simply not the case.
I'm sorry, you just said that you're using it for healthcare costs that exceed the 21, but amounts that were already allocated and appropriated for toxic exposure and programs that existed prior to the PACT Act or the Toxic Exposure Fund. Why would that be permissible?
Well, Laura Duke wanted to make a comment on this.
If I may, the way in which we execute healthcare in our system doesn't lend itself to the strict fencing that we've done, because we didn't want a situation where we hired a provider and that provider was only approved to deliver medical care to PACT eligible veterans. We wanted to ensure that we were maximizing the use of our providers' time and that we were helping as many veterans as possible receive the care timely. So what we are looking at is we are taking the PACT and the TEF and baseline funding as the total that's available for us to run our system. And then after the care is administered, we then are accounting for the total cost of the care, the visits where toxic exposed veterans are receiving the care, and those are the costs that we're...
I'm going to reclaim my time, but I'm going to say that's it's a nebulous, ambiguous cost shifting as a physician who takes care of patients. My next question is the concerns I had about the PACT Act and presumption of toxic exposure leading to a disease either now or in the future. And part of the PACT Act has research. Why do we want to continue research and development and to find out if there really is, and if an exposure is in fact related to a disease status, if we're going to presume that every disease is related to some toxic exposure, whether it is or not? And then number two, the follow-up to that is, in the PACT Act, we also continue all of the health care, all of the benefits, even if it's proven through scientific measures that there is not a causality. So is this a portion of the PACT Act and funding that we don't need because in the PACT Act, the presumption is that any toxic exposure has created disease now or in the future. And you're talking about future presumptive exposure.
I think our research program first improves the quality of the health care that we deliver by learning better ways to treat the conditions in question. And to the extent that the future disability qualifications is making sure that not only are we providing the health care, but that veterans whose quality of life has been compromised as a result of their exposures
So
are adequately compensated.
the treatment modalities is different than research into presumption, which a lot of that, I think, if we have a proper implementation of the electronic health record and coordination with the DOD would help that. I yield back my time.
Representative Brzezinski.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. Good morning to everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to the witnesses for being here for this important discussion around the PACT Act and the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund. I'd like to take a moment to just share two stories of my constituents and how the PACT Act and the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund has directly benefited actually both of them. Willie Williams and his wife, April Williams, of Belleville, Illinois, have both seen the real benefits, again, of the PACT Act and the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund. Willie served in the U.S. Navy and the Air National Guard for 20 years. He was a part of Operation Desert Storm and Operation Desert Shield. And while in service, Willie was exposed to toxic burn pits that led him to have a disability. This significantly impacted his quality of life for both him and his family. Before the PACT Act, he couldn't understand what was going on with him. He wasn't able to get the right care because they couldn't understand the type of care that he needed. And almost all of his claims were denied at that point by the VA. This was the case for many of his veteran friends that he shared with me back home who were also exposed to burn pits. They just couldn't get the answers to the questions that they had or the care that they really needed. Thanks to the PACT Act and the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund, he submitted the claims with information on his service locations and was approved for a higher percentage in his disability rating. Because of this, his physicians were able to explain to him the exact kind of care that he needed for his unique condition. His wife, April, who I was really privileged to have come with me as my guest at the State of the Union address, is a certified womb care nurse at the St. Louis VA Hospital. She did her best to care for Willie during and before the PACT Act, but also faced many hurdles in getting him the unique care he needed due to his exposure to the burn pits. Willie and April have seen significant improvements in their quality of life. They're able to move forward with their future, and Willie is getting the unique care that he needs. I bring this story with their permission today because I am concerned about the majority's bill, that it will impact future veterans with similar situations and conditions like Willie. Veterans put their lives and health on the line to protect us, as has been stated in this committee, and we know many of them who were exposed to extremely toxic chemicals that have been linked to a number of serious diseases. It is our duty now to provide them with the care that they have earned and deserve. The VA has had the ability to provide this critical care to toxically exposed veterans, thanks again to the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund. Additionally, certain positions at the VA medical facilities may be at least partially funded by the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund, and I'm extremely worried that this could hurt crucial positions such as April Williams, a certified, again, womb care nurse. If the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund was restricted in the way proposed by the majority's legislation, the VA may have to find other discretionary dollars to pay for the salaries and benefits of these important positions. So really quickly, with the time remaining, I just wanted to ask again to anyone on the panel, do you believe that the caps proposed in the majority's legislation to the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund could hinder the VA's ability to provide this important care to veterans?
We do believe that.
And an additional question I'd have too is, could this, and could being forced to pay more for care from the discretionary spending pit veterans groups against each other?
I mean, to the extent, we're going to deliver the care, and so to the extent that we have to take from other programs, we will do so. But eventually, it will affect veterans, and it could be in different groups, or it could be all groups, to be honest. But we're going to make sure that we deliver the care that we need to.
Okay. And again, for anyone on the panel, if the majority bill's passed, there's no guarantee that Congress would actually appropriate up to the proposed caps. Has the VA contemplated what would happen if Congress failed to appropriate that funding, and what kind of services would be impacted?
So as I described, we would look for other sources for that funding. It could be from infrastructure. Our average age of our infrastructure is 60 years. I mean, we can't take money from that, but we would take it from new equipment purchases. It could be from rural health programs. It could be from many programs. So other programs will suffer.
Okay. Would anyone like to add anything additional? Okay, great. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Dr. Murphy, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses coming in today. I come from a very large veteran-laden district. 1 in 10, essentially, of my constituents are veterans, so this is a big deal for me. Also helped to champion the Camp Lejeune Justice Act. That's a huge deal because I serve Camp Lejeune. Mr. Causey, I just want to continue, actually, that line of questioning. The statute is a little bit ambiguous, and VA has some written policies on how to govern this. What's not allowed to be spent for the toxic fund?
I mean, really anything that is not directly related to a toxic exposure. If that's maybe I can give you specific examples. We have to work through each case basically to find out what is the link to the toxic exposure before we can use the funding. And to give you some example of how restrictive we are, of the 25 or $26 billion in TEF that we have available, so far we've only charged that account with about $3 billion because we are going receipt by receipt. It's not that the costs aren't there, it is that we are making sure that when we charge that account, we can clearly link it back with documentation to a toxic exposure cost.
Okay. Last year, during our budget hearing, Chairman Bost asked the Secretary why the VA was planning on using the Toxic Exposure Fund to furnish newly constructed VA buildings. And the Secretary's response was that because the PACT Act allows him to do it. That's a little concerning. Are you guys still spending the TEF money for this purpose?
I'm not familiar with that reference, other than there were lease authorizations and funding in the PACT Act for leases, which I'm assuming...
Well, no, this was furnishing newly constructed buildings.
I'm not familiar. I'd have to see that for the record.
All right, I need you to look back, and I need a response, and actually the chairman should demand a response, hopefully we get one, as to why this is, because the VA has been given a large amount of money, and our job is to make sure it's used efficiently. The VA spends 5 to 1 what the British healthcare system spends on each patient, and we want to make sure that it's spent wisely, not just in the budget of a slush fund, as it will. So I need you to get back to us, please, with a definitive answer, and if so, how can anybody justify doing that? Because if this is supposed to be for patients, not furnishing buildings with nice new chairs and computers, this, that, and the other stuff, the VA has those things and has access to funds for those things. Shouldn't be coming from the fund. So I'm working on actually trying to get something rectified with the Camp Lejeune Justice Act. There's some technical corrections that we're needing to do to make sure that actually our veterans actually have access to money like that, and to limit attorney fees, and they understand this is coming, but to make sure that they have their day in court. Are there any exposures, anything that are going on with our veterans that the Toxic Fund does not fund? Are we delinquent in making sure that we're covering things that should be covered?
I mean, Congress really has done an exceptional job with this. We have everything, absolutely everything we need.
Wow, haven't heard that before from a government agency. So you're good. We don't need to give you any more money? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, we're requesting what we need, but this has been a real success. I mean, in the years I worked for government, this is probably the most successful I've seen.
I think it's successful, and I think the intent is very, very pure, but we just also cannot relinquish our duty to make sure that funds are used efficiently. That's a big deal, for me, especially with all that goes on in healthcare, but with our VA. It has to be first and foremost, number one is care for our veterans, and two, are we being good stewards of the taxpayer dollar with all this?
I 100% I share that sentiment, and we are working hard in that regard.
All right, well, thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Appreciate the panel being here. Mr. Chairman, I can't help myself, but you, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the Elizabeth Dole bill and your sentiment that it really can't be funded due to the current TEF funding. And I just have to say that I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Because if we could pass the Elizabeth Dole bill today, if we utilize the four corners agreed upon language, which makes the CBO scoring on the Elizabeth Dole bill absolutely de minimis. But I think the strategy of your leadership, not you necessarily, Mr. Chair, but your leadership, has been to handicap the Elizabeth Dole bill so you could put the very popular Elizabeth Dole bill into a package to also get some of the other sort of Republican priorities. So rather than putting the Elizabeth Dole bill on the floor that both Republicans and Democrats could proudly pass, the leadership has chosen to delay it. It is not being delayed because of cost. CBO has scored the bill at very minimally. The cost is, so I don't think the cost of the Elizabeth Dole has any impact on what we're talking about today on the TEF funding. So I just want to make that point abundantly clear. I also, so I got that off my chest. Thank you very much. Yep. So I also yesterday I met, this is to the panel, yesterday I met with some women veterans who shared some anecdotal data, that women who are enrolling for health care benefits, whether it's MST claims or PTS claims, sometimes a litany of very complicated claims, that those claims are not being addressed as quickly as male claims are, generally of similar dimensions, because of the PACT Act. So I'm not talking about the PACT Act right now, I'm talking about because of the focus on the PACT Act, which we must do, and I understand that. But because of that, some of these other claims that are kind of in backlog, if you will, women veterans are telling me, again, anecdotal data, but telling me that those claims are falling behind male claims of similar dimensions, as I said. So I don't know whether you can speak to that today or not, but I would certainly like someone to go back and look at that data. I would like the data beyond anecdotal data. If it's true, we need to do something about it.
Yeah, and we will look into that. That's not something I'd heard of. That's interesting and something that we absolutely need to look into. So if we could take that for the record and get back to you, we will do so.
Very good.
Thank you.
The last thing I wanted to mention is, or to talk about too, is the research that's built into the PACT Act. And I think the Republican legislation would severely curtail the research unless it's related to the covered, related to the covered, what's already being covered by the bill. Sorry, I'm having trouble getting that out. So I really want to know, what the intention is with regards to research, particularly how it relates to women veterans, whether it be, breast cancer, cervical cancer, but primarily infertility. And most physicians will say infertility is very hard to diagnose in terms of what the cause may be. I've heard statistics anywhere up to 80% of the time they can't diagnose the reason for infertility. And I happen to have an IVF bill that says, we should treat infertility as health care, and it shouldn't be related to a specific cause. And so I'm just curious to know if any of this research is related to infertility, and what other kinds of research are you doing related to women veterans? And I see I don't have very much time.
We don't have very much of an answer. Can we take that for the record, too? You ask tough questions for financial people. So could we take that for the record?
Absolutely.
And get back to you? Yeah,
absolutely.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you, and Mr. Chair, yield back.
Representative Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panel for coming here today to talk about this very important issue. I deployed to Iraq in 2006, 2008, and 2010 on every major base that we were on. We had burn pits. I remember a couple afternoons I actually spent several hours in burn pits searching for mistakenly discarded serialized equipment. It wasn't something that, we thought about necessarily at the time. We didn't know how harmful burn pits were. I was just worried that we were going to get in trouble because we couldn't find the serialized equipment. So I do have a little bit of experience with, this hazard that many of our veterans are coming back and getting very sick from. One of the things that I hope comes out of this hearing and others like it, or I hope that we start to count the cost of these wars that we continue to have an infatuation with engaging in all over the world. I do agree with Mr. Rosendale's sentiments and statements that Mr. Takano posted right back here on the board. And I think, here we go again. It looks like there's multiple wars on the horizon, and I don't think we're doing a good job counting the cost, not only what it could mean for our active duty individuals, and sending our blood and treasure over to these spots in the world, but how we're even going to afford it when they come back, because clearly we can't afford even to take care of the veterans we have right now. I mean, nobody can make the logical argument that when, like Mr. Self said, when we're $34 trillion in debt, we can't even afford the ones that we have now. And so I hope that we start really thinking about counting the cost. What does this cost? And, if we truly cared about our veterans, we wouldn't just be worried about, because we love to sit on these panels and say, cheer our veterans, oh, we love veterans, but do we? Do we really? Because if we really did, we wouldn't just be worried about this piece of legislation or the one coming down the pipe right after it. We'd be worried about making sure that we could provide health care for our veterans 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years down the road. And looking at the trajectory that we're on now, that's what keeps me up at night. I don't think we're going to be able to do it. Now on to my question, Mr. Rychalski. Can you give us a better idea of where the money's designated for these toxic exposure funds, where they're going to be spent in the Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Housing and Urban Development?
There are no toxic exposure funds. Our funds are not going to those programs.
Okay.
So
So the shuffling of these monies that we've been talking about, kind of moving them around because this bill seemed to be written with flexibility in the language. These monies aren't being sent to other places.
No, nowhere else. Nowhere.
Okay. Thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Lansdowne.
Oh, so I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here and for everything that you do on behalf of our veterans and our communities, and for working with the committee. I think there are really good questions that have been raised today from colleagues on both sides here, and would just encourage you, as I know you will, based on your answers today, to be engaged with the committee, each member answering these questions, and maybe even going beyond what would be typically expected, because part of this hearing has to do with concerns, legitimate concerns about making sure dollars are going to where they need to go. And I think those concerns have been addressed in some ways today, at least that's my sense. But in the follow-up, the questions, I think, can also help to alleviate some of the concerns. And, potentially there are certain things you want to do in it, moving forward that does not require congressional action, but does ensure that there is the kind of transparency and certitude about where these dollars are going that people are looking for. There is consensus that this investment is a smart one, that the cost of war toxic exposure fund is successful. It does make a big difference. We have to continue to make those investments. And there also is a very legitimate concern that I share about the debt that this country is dealing with. $34 trillion is a huge problem for us long term. Part of what we have to do is deal with wasteful spending. There's no one up here that thinks that this fund is wasteful spending, though I think there are questions that can be easily answered to ensure that there are no dollars being spent on anything other than helping our veterans. I think the area of common ground, hopefully, is understanding that tackling this deficit and debt can be done on the spending side or on the fixing of the tax code side. And one of my colleagues brought this up. I believe, in addition to dealing with wasteful spending, that the tax code has to be fixed. And the question shouldn't be, okay, well, what should we limit in terms of veterans or seniors or others, and avoid trying to say, hey, we can only give you this much, but to say to billionaires and to big corporations, you got to pay all your taxes like the rest of us. And that will help to alleviate some of the pressure on these investments. And so, a lot of people make a lot of money, and I really appreciated what Mr. Crane said about his experience, but also the cost of war. A lot of people do make a lot of money on these wars, and this has been brought up before, so this is not a new idea, but putting a fee on these defense contractors and others who make billions and billions of dollars on these wars that will pay for all of these programs to support our veterans so that they don't have to worry that anything is going to be taken from them. And so, the chair mentioned common ground and bipartisan path forward, a bipartisan path forward. I hope that that's part of the discussion. I don't mean this in an argumentative way. I do think this is part of what we have to talk about. So that was really for my colleagues. Then for you all, my hope is that, and then I'll yield back, the questions that I suspect you will, to follow up with the information, but to also appreciate that there may be some things that you all could do to alleviate some of the concerns that would mean we don't have to pursue caps. So thank you. I yield back.
Can I just make one comment? We absolutely will do so. And we are mindful, when this fund was first established, we know that Congress looked at this and thought, this is going to be something the VA takes. They're going to use it as a slush fund. They're going to abuse it. And not without precedent, right? But we have taken it very seriously, and I'm going to stand by our work, and we're going to prove to you that we are using this responsibly, and you're going to see that. We've been very transparent, and we are riding herd on this like no other.
Mr. Cismani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for coming to testify today. The passage of the PACT Act was a landmark achievement in signifying Congress's support for our veterans and receiving the care they were promised, and as they sacrificed so much, obviously, for our country. Many of my colleagues on this panel, this committee, have done that. We have a solemn duty to care for them when they return home, and I have about over 70,000 veterans in my district. So I appreciate your testimony being here today. Now, my question is for you, Mr. Rychalski. The Toxic Exposure Fund, I mean, that's what we're here to talk about, and you've answered a lot of questions around this, but if you could just entertain a couple more here for me. It's pretty complicated, and it got more complicated as the PACT Act moved through the House and the Senate. What challenges specifically have you faced in using the fund to carry out the PACT Act?
Well, believe it or not, not that it's overly restrictive, but initially when we received the PACT Act and the Toxic Exposure Fund, it looked to us like we could use the Toxic Exposure Fund for a lot of things like I described, right? But it turned out we can't use it for a lot of things that are not that are in the PACT Act that are not toxic exposure related. So, give you an example. It took us 7 months to come up with the policies for how we could use toxic exposure funding for VBA. And that was going line by line with our general counsel, fiscal lawyers, OMB, asking the IG for reviews to make sure. So a lot of it is just making sure that we are adhering to the intent of the law. So 7 months is a long time to come up with a methodology and a policy, but that's the care that we're taking. So some of it is just that. It's just making sure that we're following your intent.
All right, and we've talked about this as well, but you oppose the chairman's legislation because you say it would constrain the VA's ability to update care as the toxic exposure science evolves. Without a doubt, it took decades of legislation and science for VA to admit a service connection for Agent Orange and other exposures. More often than not, I believe this committee is a force for change within the VA. Wouldn't removing this committee's ability to pass new legislation also hold the VA back?
It will, and that's a problem that's got to be solved. Agreed. Yep.
Thank you. And Ms. Duke, if I can transfer over to you real quick. As an appropriator, I sit in the Appropriations Committee. I hear constantly from my constituents about the need to rein in federal spending. And we talked about the $1 trillion in debt that we have, which are very troubling for us. The value of Congress appropriating on an annual basis is that we can continuously look at the program's effectiveness and evaluate spending levels. If the VA, for whatever reason, spent all the Toxic Exposure Fund money before the end of the fiscal year, how would you fund health care under the PACT Act?
So to the extent that our request includes both discretionary and TEF funds balanced across the 2 fiscal years, we believe that we are adequately funded through the 2 sources of money through 24 and into 25 to meet veterans' needs. So I think even whether it's TEF or base, we will use those funds to continue to provide care through 2025.
So you're basically saying there's practically zero chance that the money runs out. The money is, for whatever reason, spent quicker than it should be, and the fund goes away. What would happen? I want to make sure that the purpose of my question here is if this money runs out, or if it's for whatever reason spent sooner than it's intended for, as you laid out, it's planned to, but things happen. This is, I'm trying to make a point here of the value of Congress's involvement here. And I'm speaking both as a member of this committee, but also an appropriator. So as we look at the funding mechanism of this, we have to make sure that our veterans are going to be taken care of, and that Congress has an ability to have a say in this on an annual basis.
Which is why we include the TEF resources as part of our annual request to the Congress, both in terms of 25 and in 26. If you look in our budget, we have an annual TEF request to accompany our advance appropriation request for 2026. So we are communicating the need for across both of the appropriations. And we would ask that you as an appropriator and the rest of Congress provide those resources in order for us to deliver the care as projected in the budget.
Well, my time's almost up. As an appropriator, I'll always support our veterans, and I want to make sure that they have all the resources that they need. I also wholeheartedly believe in the involvement of Congress through this process and the oversight of these funds to make sure that they're properly used and responsibly managed for our veterans so that they're there when they need them. And that's my job, both as a member of this committee and the Appropriations Committee as well. So expect me to be asking more questions on this. Thank you both.
Representative McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your testimony here today. And when I get into my questions, I do want to talk about these caps and what they ultimately mean for the care of our veterans. I want to start off by saying, though, one of the reasons I like this committee, I think you've seen it today, is that there is a real passion to come together in a bipartisan way and make sure that our veterans have the care not just that they need, but that they deserve and that they have earned. And so when we're talking about this, I think it is important, as Representative DeLuzio pointed out, that we're talking about the cost of war toxic exposure fund, cost of war. From Agent Orange to toxic burn pits, these are wounds of war. They're just like a bullet wound or something else, but just because they don't show up immediately doesn't mean they're any less serious or any less deadly. Just yesterday, I spoke to a veteran who she said she's been exposed to toxic burn pits and has developed asthma because of the scarring in her lungs. We hope that's it. There are many more who have worse. And so when we're here today and we're talking about funding and affordability, I also want to make sure we spend money efficiently and effectively. I want to make sure, I came from state government where we had to balance a budget. But we know that the PACT Act is working. It is benefiting millions of veterans across this country, back in my district in Louisville, Kentucky. And I'm a little taken aback by the efforts to curtail a program that is working for our veterans for wounds they sustained during the course of war. We're talking about affordability. The question isn't whether we can afford to take care of our veterans. The question is, can we afford not to? And if we're going to talk about affordability, I think we have some answers. In other rooms in this building, they're talking about cutting taxes for the billionaires and wealthiest corporations in America. Why is it in this room the veterans are on the chopping block? I think we can do more. These are the same veterans who have to pay federal income tax on their military retirement, while, according to a March 2024 report from Americans for Tax Fairness, 35 major U.S. corporations between 2018 and 2022 paid less in federal income taxes than they paid to their top 5 executives. We have the money to take care of our veterans. It's a question of priority. It's the question of, can we afford not to take care of the men and women who put on a uniform and were willing to sacrifice everything to keep this the greatest country in the world. So I want to specifically ask about Title II of the PACT Act, which created a new expedited process for developing new presumptive illnesses in service locations. The PACT Act was not intended to be a definitive or a one and done. Obviously, the research the VA is conducting on toxic exposure can currently be funded by the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund, as is some portion of the salary of those who are evaluating that evidence. However, it seems as though the legislation we have before us today is ambiguous as to whether that research can even be conducted using this funding. So in the time I have remaining, Mr. Rakowski, what would the caps on the cost of the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund mean for future presumptives? If, for example, the VA wanted to add coverage and benefits for Fort McClellan or K2 or PFAS.
So that is one of our concerns, the narrowing of the scope. Our understanding or read of the law would be that we would not be able to use the fund under the Improvement Act for the costs associated with that. So we would have to use base funding or find other funding for that. And the same is true for some veterans that were already awarded a disability for environmental conditions before the PACT Act. If they would not be eligible under some scenarios for care funded by the Toxic Exposure Fund. So both before and after the PACT Act, because it's more narrowly scoped, we'd have to fund that out of existing resources, which could be problematic for us, especially going forward, because we don't know where this is going to lead.
Thank you for that. And what is the VA's sense on how the majority's proposed legislation may affect the ability to execute the new presumptive decision process as delineated by Title II of PACT?
I'm going to refer that to Lashiko.
Perfect.
Thank you. So the process that VA historically has used to determine the presumptive conditions often took decades to work through in order to complete that particular process. It was often very frustrating, obviously, for veterans, for their families and caregivers, as well as their clinical teams, and led to delays in veterans receiving the health care and benefits they earned and needed. The new provisions under Title II establish a process by which VA may streamline presumptions of service connection based on toxic exposure in a clear and transparent manner.
Thank you, and I see my time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Takano, do you have closing remarks?
I do, sir.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. We've discussed the effects of the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund on the Congressional Budget Office scoring in the past, and we will discuss it again in the future. And as I have said in the past, I recognize that under normal circumstances, CBO scoring related to the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund could prove an impediment to moving new and expanded legislation on behalf of veterans. However, this Congress, under this majority, has been about the furthest thing from normal circumstances as we can get. In fact, the Toxic Exposure Fund has not proven to be an impediment to passing legislation at all. And there are two main reasons why that is. One, the House Majority Leadership has deviated from past precedent and required offsets to both discretionary and mandatory spending. And in the face of that, CBO scoring related to the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund is largely irrelevant. Because if the entire cost of a bill must be offset, then it doesn't matter which side of the ledger the cost is on. Second, the House majority is woefully inept, and they cannot even muster sufficient votes among their members for their own priorities. And we've seen paralysis as a result, leading to one of the least productive Congresses in history. In fact, the majority has only seen fit to dedicate less than 6 hours of actual floor time to veterans legislation. Surely veterans are worth more than 6 hours of this Congress's time. But proceeding with this legislation now is both unnecessary and unproductive. Instead, as I've said all along, we need to have a more fulsome conversation with all of the interested parties and get buy-in from the appropriators and the budget committee, the appropriations and budget committees in both the House and the Senate. We need also the VA, the VSOs, and other stakeholders to be a part of these discussions before proceeding down a path of changing the Cost of War Toxic Exposure Fund. Because there is very little upside to this bill and an enormous risk of downside. And I would ask the members present here today, do you think everyday Americans care about how CBO evaluates the cost of care we provide to our veterans? Do you think veterans exposed to toxic substances as they walk into the VA wonder whether the cost of their health care will be labeled mandatory or discretionary? Of course they don't. They care about whether or not this country will uphold the promise it made to care for them after their service. And do you think that a military spouse or child or whose veteran is dying of cancer cares about budget deficits? No. They want care for their sick family member. This fund is absolutely crucial to ensuring VA has the resources necessary to fully support our veterans and to deliver the new benefits available to them without having to sacrifice existing programs. And the mandatory nature of this fund is our guarantee that those resources will be available for generations to come. Not protecting funding for PACT is essentially defunding other VA programs or pitting PACT beneficiaries against other domestic programs. Scaling back the fund, as Republicans have suggested, would force unconscionable choices. Which life-threatening conditions does the minority propose not to cover? Which veteran do they suggest we ask to live with their diseases untreated? Eliminating the health care and benefits for our veterans are entitled to because we are concerned about scores is lunacy. The intent of Congress in the PACT Act was to stop pitting funding for veterans against other domestic priorities, such as funding for cancer research or vaccine development, aid to school districts for educating students with disabilities, or funding for housing assistance for the elderly and special needs populations. We achieved that. Would the majority rather fund long-term care for elderly veterans or health care for toxic exposed veterans? Should we fund programs to continue to reduce the rate of homelessness among veterans or prioritize funding for veterans who now have Parkinson's disease because of their toxic exposure. We passed the PACT Act because toxic exposure is a cost of war, and our country needs to pay for the health care and benefits these veterans have earned. I'm sure folks are tired of hearing me say that, but it seems that some in this House and on this committee need reminding. I share no sympathy for those who voted for this bill but suddenly have buyer's remorse now that the pact is law. We ask men and women to sacrifice their lives to protect our freedom. The least we can do is to take care of them when they return home. I hope my colleagues here today keep this in mind so that we don't have to make the mistake of previous Congresses by ignoring the needs of veterans. We did the right thing when we passed My PACT Act. We listened to veterans and then followed through on our promise. We must now commit ourselves to keeping that promise. Thank you. Now yield back.
Thank the ranking member. And I'd like to make a couple notes into the record here. First off, according to CBO, the mandatory cost of the Elizabeth Dole Veterans Package was $2.86 billion over 10 years before we started revising the bill. Now, a significant portion of that is due to the fact that the Toxic Exposure Fund double counted existing problems. We're continuing to work on the bill to get the costs down to watch and do our offset. And I would also remind the ranking member and my Democrat colleagues that if they are so fortunate to persuade the American people to put them back in the majority, this problem is still and will not go away. We've got to fix it, or we will be frozen without the ability to continue to offer significant things to improve the lives of our veterans and deal with existing problems. I don't think the rhetoric that has existed, now let me tell you that I think this hearing was good in the fact that we were getting it out there. I don't care about the words. If you want to change a first line or whatever, but quit being offended by the words and let's deal with the actual issue. And how do we do that? We realize that we can't double count the costs. We need to make sure that we implement the PACT Act like it was meant to be and provide those services. No one on our side of the aisle said that we don't want to provide those services. We are saying that we need to be wise in providing those services so that the people anywhere on our VA list that need the help are not shortchanged. Well, I appreciate the witnesses being here today to discuss the important issue, and I appreciate the give and take. And I think it's been a good give and take. And I want to repeat it. If anyone has a proposal besides this one to fix a problem, I'm here. We don't want to say, oh, we own it as Republicans. We don't want to say, oh, we don't want the Democrat. This is a bipartisan problem that we've got to get fixed. We have handcuffed ourselves on this committee to try to figure out and be responsible now. We've got to unhandcuff ourselves so that all veterans and family members and survivors can receive the benefits they deserve. And we can accomplish that a lot. We've accomplished a lot over the last few years, but this is no time to quit. Veterans deserve a VA that's involved to meet their needs, not one that is stuck in the past. With that, I ask unanimous consent that all members shall have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extenuous materials. Hearing no objections, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.